I planned a coordinated family photo shoot to surprise my husband with the news that our fourth baby was finally the son he had always dreamed about. But the moment he understood what the little blue outfit meant, his reaction was nothing like I expected. The forensic accountant's email was still open on my laptop when Wesley handed our daughter a 9-year-old family trust document disguised as a photography prop. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that 3 hours earlier, at 6:52 a.m., I had read the words material breach of fiduciary duty for the first time in my life, sitting alone at my kitchen table in my robe, coffee going cold beside a manila folder I'd been building for 6 weeks without telling my husband it existed. I am a claims adjuster. 11 years, mostly property and casualty. The last 4 specializing in cases where somebody's story doesn't quite match somebody's paperwork. I know what it looks like when numbers are telling the truth and people aren't. I know the particular quiet a document makes when it's been altered by someone who assumed nobody would ever read it closely enough to notice. I had been reading closely for 6 weeks. And that Saturday afternoon, in a park, in front of a photographer I'd hired to capture the happiest surprise of my husband's life, I watched my father-in-law say the word worthy about a 14-karat gold watch, and I understood, all at once, the way you understand a fracture pattern the second you see the actual photo, instead of the insurance description. Exactly how long he had been building toward that word, and exactly how much it had already cost my daughters. This is the story of how a gender reveal photo shoot became the day I stopped protecting a man who had spent 11 years deciding which of his grandchildren deserved protecting. I'd been married to Wesley for 9 years when I first noticed the number that didn't make sense. It wasn't dramatic. It never is, at the start. I was helping him find an old insurance policy for our home refinance, digging through the fireproof box we kept in the closet, the one with birth certificates and the girls' social security cards and the manila folder marked Diane. Trust, his late mother's handwriting still visible on the tab in blue ballpoint. Faded, but legible. Diane had died when Kayla was 18 months old. I'd never met her. Wesley talked about her rarely, and always carefully, the way you talk about someone whose absence still has sharp edges 11 years later. What I knew, she'd been thoughtful, she'd been generous, and before the cancer took her, she'd set up a trust. $180,000, split evenly among all grandchildren, born or to be born, because she'd told Wesley more than once that she didn't want money to ever make one grandchild feel smaller than another. Mike was trustee. That had never struck me as strange. He was Wesley's father. It was a reasonable, even generous assumption of trust. I wasn't looking for anything that day. I was looking for a homeowner's policy. But the folder was thin, thinner than I expected for 11 years of quarterly statements. And when I flipped through it, one number on one page caught my eye, the way a bent guardrail catches an adjuster's eye on a routine site visit. Technically explainable, structurally suspicious. The most recent statement showed a balance of $61,400. I did the math without meaning to. 4 grandchildren, 11 years of modest growth on an initial $180,000, minus reasonable distributions for things like the girls' orthodontia, and a summer camp Wesley had mentioned once. Even accounting for that, $61,400 was low. Lower than it should have been by a margin that, in my professional life, would have triggered a documentation request on its own. I told myself it was nothing. Trusts fluctuate. Markets fluctuate. Mike wasn't a financial professional. Maybe he'd made conservative, even clumsy decisions that cost the fund some growth. I put the folder back. I found the insurance policy. I didn't mention it to Wesley. That was the first time I was wrong about what I was looking at. I brought it up 2 nights later, casually, over dishes, in the tone you use when you want an answer but not a conversation. Hey, do you know how your mom's trust has been doing? I saw the folder when I was looking for the insurance stuff. Wesley didn't look up from the pan he was scrubbing. Dad handles all that. Right, but do you know the balance? Roughly? No idea. Why? No reason. Just curious. He believed me. That's the part that still sits uncomfortably in my chest when I think back on it. Not that he lied to me, but that he had no reason to think there was anything worth lying about, because he had simply never looked. His mother had died. His father had taken the folder and the responsibility. And Wesley, grieving, 26 years old at the time, trusting his own father the way you're supposed to be able to, had never once requested a statement in 11 years. Does it matter? He asked. It's for the girls' college eventually. Dad's not going to mess it up. I said, of course not. And I meant it, mostly. And I let it go for 9 more days. I am not proud of what I did next, exactly, though I'd do it again. I called the trust's custodian bank, a regional firm in Ohio, the same one Diane had used, and identified myself as Wesley's spouse, handling paperwork for an upcoming refinance that required documentation of all beneficiary assets held on our daughter's behalf. It wasn't fully a lie. It also wasn't fully true. I knew the difference, and I made the call anyway. The representative, a soft-spoken man named Curtis, was helpful in the specific way people are helpful when they don't yet understand they're being asked a dangerous question. He couldn't release full account history without trustee authorization, he explained, but he could confirm the account was active, confirm the current balance matched what I already had, and, because I asked directly whether the distribution schedule had ever been amended, he paused just slightly before saying yes. There's an amendment on file from about 4 years ago, he said. Change some of the distribution language. You'd need trustee sign-off to see the specifics, but it's noted here. 4 years ago. Kayla would have been 7. The twins would have been 3. I thanked him. I hung up. My hands were not steady when I opened my laptop and started a new folder on my desktop. One I labeled, with a caution I'm still slightly embarrassed by, Home Refi Docs 2. The next piece came from somewhere I hadn't thought to look. Wesley's brother, Danny. Danny and Wesley weren't close. A slow drift after Diane's death, nothing dramatic, just two brothers who stopped calling as often as they should have. But Danny's son, Marcus, had just turned 6, and Danny had posted on the kind of social media I check more out of habit than interest, a photo of Marcus in a blazer and tie outside a building I recognized because I'd looked it up before. Whitfield Preparatory Academy. Tuition, I knew from a client file 2 years prior, in a completely unrelated context, ran just under $19,000 a year for early elementary. The caption read, "So proud of my boy. Grandpa's been so generous helping make this happen. Carrying on a family tradition." Whitfield was Dad's idea before it was even a school we'd looked at. I sat with that for a long time. Not because a grandfather helping pay for a grandchild's school was inherently wrong. It wasn't. It was the phrase "Dad's been so generous" sitting next to a trust balance that had shrunk by more than half over 11 years, sitting next to a distribution amendment made 4 years ago that none of the trust's other beneficiaries, my daughters, had ever been told about. I am a claims adjuster. I know that a single piece of evidence rarely proves anything on its own. I also know that 3 pieces of evidence, each individually explainable, can add up to a pattern that is not. I had 3 pieces. I made a 4th call. This time I didn't pretend to be handling paperwork for a refinance. I asked Wesley directly to request a full statement history and a copy of any amendments on file. As co-parent of 3 of the trust's 4 beneficiaries, he had every right to ask, and I told him honestly that I'd noticed some things that concerned me and wanted his eyes on it too. He looked at me for a long moment. "You think something's wrong with the trust?" "I think I want to see the paperwork, that's all." He requested it that afternoon. It arrived by mail 6 days later, a stack half an inch thick, the trust's original terms, 11 years of quarterly statements, and, near the bottom, a 2-page amendment dated 4 years and 2 months earlier, signed by Mike as sole trustee, using a provision in the original document that allowed the trustee reasonable discretion in distribution timing to serve beneficiaries' evolving needs. The amendment didn't remove the girls as beneficiaries. It didn't need to. It simply reweighted the discretionary language so that distributions could be made unevenly based on documented need, with no requirement to notify other beneficiaries or their guardians when a distribution occurred. Reading it, I understood something Wesley hadn't yet. His father hadn't stolen from his daughters, not in a way any court would call theft. He had done something slower and, in its way, worse. He had rewritten the rules of his dead wife's promise so quietly that nobody but him would ever know the promise had been broken, unless somebody went looking. I showed Wesley the amendment. He read it twice. Then he said very quietly, "She wrote that trust so nobody would ever feel like this," and put it down on the counter like it had gotten hot in his hands. We didn't call Mike that night. We agreed, and this was, in hindsight, the wrong call, though I understand why we made it, to get a professional read before confronting him. Wesley didn't want to accuse his father of something we might be misreading. I didn't disagree. I am, by training, someone who does not accuse until the documentation supports it. The professional we found was Denise Okafor, a trust and estate attorney with 19 years of practice, recommended by a colleague at my office who'd used her for an unrelated matter. I described the situation over the phone in the flattened, careful language of someone reciting facts instead of feelings. She asked me to send everything, the original trust, the amendment, the statements, and call her back in 3 days. She called back in 2. "The amendment itself isn't necessarily improper," she said. "Trustees often have discretion language like that, and courts generally respect it, within limits. What I'd want to understand is whether the discretion was actually used to serve the beneficiary's needs, or whether it was used to systematically favor one over the others. That's a fiduciary duty question, and it's a much stronger claim if there's a pattern. How would we know if there's a pattern? You'd need a full accounting. Every distribution, every date, every recipient, cross-referenced against what each beneficiary actually needed at the time. That's not something I do. That's forensic accounting." She recommended someone, Priya Chandrasekaran, CPA, CFE, 14 years specializing in trust and estate disputes. I called that afternoon. Priya's process took 11 days and involved paperwork I hadn't known existed. Wire transfer records, cleared checks the bank had to pull from archive, a line item accounting going back to the trust's funding. She sent her preliminary findings on a Thursday in a document titled, "With the plain bluntness I would come to appreciate in her Chandrasekaran forensic findings, Diane M. redacted trust, draft." The findings were exact in a way the last 3 weeks of my suspicion had not been. Of $180,000 originally funded, $118,600 had been distributed over 11 years. Of that, $94,300, just under 80%, had gone toward expenses benefiting one grandchild, Marcus. Tuition payments to Whitfield Preparatory Academy, made in 9 installments over 3 years, paid directly from the trust to the school, not routed through any education savings mechanism that would have required notice to the other beneficiaries. The 3 girls' combined distributions, over the same 11 years, totaled $24,300, largely orthodontia and 1 summer camp, exactly as Wesley remembered. The most recent tuition payment, $6,200, made directly to Whitfield had cleared 9 days before I first opened that folder looking for a homeowner's insurance policy. I read the report at 6:52 a.m. on a Saturday, alone, before anyone else in the house was awake. 3 hours before we were scheduled to leave for a photo shoot, I had spent 6 weeks planning as a surprise for the same man whose father's decisions I had just spent 6 weeks quietly documenting. I did not know at that moment that I was about to hand my father-in-law a silver box with a tiny blue outfit inside, in front of the exact granddaughter whose share of her grandmother's promise had just been reduced on paper to a fraction of her cousin's. I almost canceled that morning. I sat with the forensic report open on my laptop and thought seriously about calling the photographer and pushing everything a week, giving myself time to figure out how to tell Wesley what I'd found before I handed his father a silver box in front of his children. But I hadn't told him yet, not because I was hiding it, but because Denise had asked me, gently, to let her send a formal request for full trust documentation before we said anything to Mike directly, so he wouldn't have time to alter or explain away records before an attorney had them in writing. That request was scheduled to go out Monday. This was Saturday. I told myself I had 48 hours where nothing I knew yet needed to change anything I'd already planned. I was wrong about that too, but I understand now why I believed it at the time. The park was golden that afternoon, sunlight cutting long yellow lines through the trees the way it does in the pictures you actually hope for. The girls spun in their pink dresses, laughing every time the fabric flared. Wesley wore his father's old watch for the photos, the same leather band Diane had worn on Wesley's father before Wesley was born, worn soft from decades of use, the same watch Mike had once told him, when Wesley was 12, would go to Wesley's son someday, whenever that son existed. Mike sat on a bench nearby, arms crossed, watching everything the way he always did, like a judge deciding whether the trial was going his way. "You've been very mysterious about today," Wesley whispered to me, sliding his arm around my waist. "You'll see," I said, and I meant it as tenderness, not as the small, sharp thing it would become 40 minutes later. The photographer lined us up, snapped picture after picture, the girls giggling, Wesley joking with them, the ordinary chaos of our family caught in decent light. Then she smiled at me, my signal. I handed Wesley the box. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was excitement. "Open it," I said. He lifted the lid, moved the tissue paper aside, pulled out the tiny blue outfit, and for one full second, I watched him understand what it meant, his face already halfway into the smile I'd pictured for 6 weeks. Then it stopped. His hands went still around the fabric. The smile didn't fade so much as switch off all at once, like something behind his eyes had made a decision faster than the rest of his face could follow. "It's a boy," I said, my voice cracking with excitement I hadn't yet noticed had stopped being returned. "We're finally having a son." He didn't answer. He looked past me, at his father, and for 1 second I saw something on my husband's face I had never expected to see there. Fear. "Wesley, tell me you didn't tell the girls I wanted this," he said, low enough that the photographer had to lean in to keep hearing. My stomach dropped. "What? Please, tell me you didn't." I felt my face go hot in front of the photographer, our daughters, his father. "Wesley, you've talked about a son for years. Fishing, the watch. You've dreamed about this since the girls were babies." He closed his eyes like the words had physically hurt him. That's when Mike laughed, behind us, standing up from the bench. "Of course he has," Mike said. "Every man wants a son, someone to carry his name, someone to continue this family." Wesley's whole body went stiff. "Family traditions," he muttered, "like fishing at the lake, like private school." I hadn't told him to say that. I hadn't told him anything about Whitfield, about Priya's report, about the number $94,300 that had been sitting in my chest since 6:52 that morning. He said it on his own, and I understood, watching Mike's face flicker, just slightly, just enough, that some part of Wesley already suspected what I had spent 6 weeks confirming. Our oldest daughter, Kayla, stopped smiling. She looked between her father and her grandfather, then down at her shoes. "Wesley, what is going on?" I demanded. "Somebody tell me right now." He looked at me, pain behind his eyes that frightened me more than his anger would have. "You couldn't have known," he said quietly. "Known what?" "Not here." He glanced at our girls. "Not in front of them." Mike stepped closer, that same satisfied look settling back over his face. "Don't ruin the moment, son. You've waited a long time for this." "So have I." "So you did want a boy this whole time," I said, hurt sharpening into something else. "Then why are you acting like I've done something wrong?" "Because I did something wrong," Wesley said. "Before today. A long time before today. I let him talk about our daughters like they were something to get through on the way to what actually mattered, and I never once asked what that was costing them." He set the blue outfit down on the picnic blanket, gently, like it deserved better than what was about to happen around it. Then he knelt in front of Kayla and took both her hands. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice shaking, "do you remember what you asked me this morning?" Kayla's lower lip trembled. She looked at her father, then at her grandfather, then at her shoes again. "This morning," Wesley said gently when she didn't answer, "before we left the house, Grandpa told you I was finally going to get the son I'd been waiting for, and you asked me if I was disappointed, that you and your sisters weren't boys." The park went silent in a way I felt in my chest. Mike opened his mouth. Wesley looked at him. One look, level and final, and Mike, for once, closed it again. "It's okay," Wesley whispered to Kayla. "You didn't do anything wrong asking that. I did something wrong letting you ever have a reason to." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked him, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "She only asked me 20 minutes before we left the house," Wesley said. "I was going to explain everything everything after the photos. I didn't want to blow up the morning before we'd even gotten here. Mike scoffed, recovering his voice. You're making a huge deal out of nothing. A son carries the family name. That's not cruelty. That's tradition. Say that again, Wesley said, standing. You know I'm right. A son continues things. That's how families work. Stop turning this into something ugly, Mike said when nobody answered him right away. You're finally having your son. That's good news. I felt something in my chest. 6 weeks of documentation, of careful phone calls, of a forensic accountant's exact numbers finally reached the surface. Is that why Marcus's tuition came straight out of Diane's trust? I asked. Because he's the one who continues things? The park went quieter still. Mike's face did something I had never seen it do in 9 years. It lost for just a moment the certainty that had always been its default setting. That has nothing to do with today. It has everything to do with today, I said. I have a forensic accounting report showing that of $118,000 distributed from your wife's trust over 11 years, $94,000 went to one grandchild's private school tuition, paid directly with no notice to any of the other beneficiaries, including 3 of your own granddaughters, standing right here in front of you. You've been investigating me. I've been reading the paperwork you didn't think anyone would ever read. Wesley turned to his father fully now, the watch on his wrist catching the light. Diane wrote that trust so none of her grandchildren would ever feel smaller than another one. You didn't just break that. You amended the document 4 years ago so you could break it quietly, forever, without anyone finding out unless they went looking. I did what I thought was best for this family. You did what you thought was best for the version of this family you wanted, Wesley said. Not the one you actually have. Mike's eyes moved almost involuntarily to the watch. Well, he said, something in his voice trying and failing to find its old footing. At least now there will finally be someone worthy of my father's watch. The word worthy landed in the middle of the picnic blanket like something dropped from a height. Wesley looked down at the watch on his own wrist, the one he'd worn for the photos, the one his father had told him at 12 would go to a son someday. Then he looked at Kayla, still holding his other hand, still watching him with an uncertainty I never wanted to see on her face again. Mike stepped forward. Don't you dare. Wesley unclasped it anyway. That watch passes from father to son, Mike said. She can't carry the name. I moved between them, without entirely deciding to. She carries everything that matters, I said. Wesley knelt in front of Kayla a second time. I need you to understand something, he said. I have never once wished you were anyone other than exactly who you are. Not you, not your sisters. You were never something to get through on the way to someone else. You were always exactly who I wanted. Then he fastened his father's watch around his daughter's small wrist. It belongs to you now. Mike stood frozen, the satisfaction gone from his face entirely, replaced by something that looked for the first time in my memory like the beginning of understanding what he'd actually done. The other girls crowded around Kayla, fascinated by the watch swallowing her small wrist. Kayla looked down at it, then up at her father, and finally, for the first time since the box had been opened, smiled. The photographer, who had gone still through all of it, lifted her camera one more time. Stay exactly like that, she said quietly. She took the picture. Wesley kneeling in the grass. Our daughters gathered around him, an heirloom on a 7-year-old's wrist, and just outside the frame, a grandfather standing alone with the first real consequence he'd faced in 11 years of deciding, quietly, on paper, who in his family counted. Denise's formal request for full trust documentation went out Monday morning as planned, except now it went out alongside something Denise hadn't originally anticipated needing, a signed statement from Wesley, as a beneficiary's parent and co-trustee adjacent party, formally requesting Mike's removal as trustee on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty, supported by Priya's completed forensic report. Mike's response, delivered through an attorney of his own 3 weeks later, was not an admission. It was, Denise told us, close to the best-case version of a bad outcome, a proposed settlement in which Mike would resign as trustee voluntarily, in exchange for the matter not proceeding to a formal breach of fiduciary duty claim in probate court, which could have exposed him to personal liability for the full amount of the disproportionate distributions. He's choosing this because the alternative is worse for him, Denise explained, on a call where her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has had this exact conversation with dozens of families before us. It's not remorse, it's arithmetic, but the outcome is the same. The trust gets a neutral trustee, and there's a path to restoring some of what was taken. The sum mattered. Priya's report, submitted as part of the settlement negotiation, established that full restoration wasn't possible. The tuition payments had already been made, the money already spent on 3 years of an education that couldn't retroactively be unprovided. What was negotiable was the remaining $61,400 principal balance and a partial restitution figure for the girls' shares going forward, structured at Denise's recommendation, so future distributions required written notice to both parents of any beneficiary before funds moved. A new trustee was appointed in October, not Wesley, who felt too close to it, and not me. Denise gently but firmly explained that as a non-blood beneficiary's spouse, I wasn't an appropriate candidate regardless of how much of the documentation I'd assembled, but a professional fiduciary Denise's firm worked with regularly, whose only job going forward was to follow the trust exactly as Diane had written it 11 years earlier. Marcus's tuition, going forward, would need to come from somewhere else. Danny, when Wesley finally called him, a longer, harder conversation than either of them expected. One that ended with more honesty than either brother had offered the other in years. Said he hadn't known where the payments were coming from. He'd assumed his father was simply generous with his own money. He believed Wesley. The two of them, for the first time since Diane's funeral, started talking again with something other than obligation behind it. Mike did not attend Thanksgiving that year, or Christmas. Wesley called him twice. Both calls were short, neither warm. "I'm not trying to punish him," Wesley told me, the week before Christmas, watching Kayla's watch catch the light of the tree as she reached for an ornament. "I just don't know yet what it looks like to trust him again. I'm not going to pretend I do." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there is one yet. The photograph from that afternoon hangs in our hallway now. Wesley kneeling in the grass, our 3 daughters gathered around him, the watch bright against Kayla's small wrist and just at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, the empty bench where Mike had been sitting a moment before. Kayla still wears the watch sometimes, though it slides loose on her wrist, and she has to hold her arm a certain way to keep it from sliding off entirely. She's asked twice why Grandpa doesn't come around anymore. Wesley has answered both times the same way. "Grandpa made some choices that weren't fair to you and your sisters. We're figuring out what happens next." It's not a complete answer. It's an honest one, which felt, to both of us, like the better trade. The trust, under its new trustee, has resumed distributing exactly as Diane wrote it, evenly, on notice, to all 4 grandchildren, including Marcus, whose share going forward will be identical to his cousins, for the first time in his life. I still work in claims. I still read documents for the gap between what they say and what actually happened. Most days, that skill stays where it belongs, in case files, in conference rooms, in the specific, contained work of figuring out whose story matches whose paperwork. But I think about that Saturday afternoon more than I expected to. Not the fear on Wesley's face when he opened the box, though I still see that sometimes, in the quiet moment before sleep. What I think about is the 48 hours before it, when I sat on a forensic accountant's report and told myself I had time, that nothing I knew yet needed to change what I'd already planned. I was wrong about that. I'm grateful now that I was wrong in the direction I was, because the photograph that actually hangs in our hallway isn't the one I spent 6 weeks planning. It's better. It's the one where, instead of a surprise landing the way I'd imagined it, my family found out, all at once, in the worst possible setting, in front of the worst possible audience, exactly what kind of family we actually intended to be.